Good evening. I am Gwydion Sullivan, Penn Faulkner's Executive Director, and I'm so grateful we all get to be together tonight, even virtually. We are living through such difficult times, and I don't know about you, but one of my greatest comforts is the enrichment and the deftness and the nuance and the power of fiction, which is what brings us together tonight. So thank you so much for being here. Most of you probably know Penn Faulkner, but in case some of you don't, we are a national literary organization that's best known for giving out the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction and the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story. But we also run a variety of education programs that bring visiting authors and donated books and writing instruction into underserved classrooms in DC, all at no cost to the schools, to inspire the next generation of readers and writers. And of course, we also hold public literary programs just like this one. We believe that our culture only thrives when stories from diverse perspectives enrich our lives. Tonight, we are very lucky to hear from three people who tell stories that represent very different perspectives on the human experience: family, community, intersecting identities, and survival. First, we have Angie Cruz, the author of the novels How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water, Soledad, Let It Rain Coffee, and Dominicana, as well as the founder and editor-in-chief of Asterix, a literary and arts journal. We have Jonathan Escoffery, the author of If I Survive You, his first book, which was one of our most recent Penn Faulkner Award finalists, and which has also been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And we have Sarah Thankam Mathews, the author of All This Could Be Different, which is also her first novel. Sarah is the recipient of fellowships from the Asian American Writers Workshop and the Iowa Writers Workshop. She grew up in Oman and India, immigrating to the United States at 17. And finally, to my absolute joy, our moderator tonight is Penn Faulkner's own Jung Yun, a member of our board of directors, as well as an accomplished author whose novel, Oh Beautiful, which I absolutely loved, was a New York Times editor's pick and one of the San Francisco Chronicle's best books of 2021. And with that, welcome and thank you, Jung.
Thank you so much, Gwydion. And a special thanks to Sarah Silberman, Director of Awards and Literary Programs, Sherry Hammerman, Marketing Coordinator, and everyone at Penn Faulkner for making this event possible. I'm so excited to be here with all of you this evening and to have an opportunity to talk to our three guest authors. I actually have more questions than we have time, so I'm just going to jump right in and ask each of our authors to turn on their mics and their cameras and just give them a moment to do that. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
Hey, Jonathan. And
Hi.
there's Angie. Hi, everybody. Thank you and welcome. I'm so excited. I recognize that not everybody in the audience today has read all of your books yet, although I hope they certainly will in the near future. To get us started, could each of you just tell us a bit about the person who anchors your book and how you came to discover this character and decided that you wanted to write a whole world about them? Let's start with Angie first. Okay.
You're asking Jung, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I'm
Angie.
so sorry. My internet is unstable, and it's because I'm right now right next to a hospital, and there's interference. So, I'm sorry, but I will try my best. So, your question was, how did I come to write this book?
Tell us a little bit about Caro Romero, how you came to discover her and decide that you wanted to build this book around her.
So, you know, when I started working on this book, it was 2017, and I was at a moment of my life, kind of, you know, I was full of despair. Trump was president. It was 2017, and I was on a subway platform, and I was thinking that maybe I should find something I could do that would be more useful for society, like become an immigration lawyer, go work on the border, do translation work. I was having a very difficult time selling my book, Dominicana. It had been circulating for 4 years, and I was thinking of switching careers. And, I think what's so interesting about writing, like books saved my life. We're all in this, like, thinking about what could books do in this moment that is so fraught. And for me, as a young person, when I was very angry and I didn't know what to do in the world, I started to read, and books were the thing that helped me find language and sort of become more functional in the world instead of just become inert, and at that moment I also was feeling very scared, and suddenly, like, when I was thinking of quitting and starting over, like quitting writing and starting over, Cara Romero's voice came to me, like literally, like it was like a deep, I don't know, resource that I must have, a storytelling resource. And Cara Romero came to me and she said, "My name is Cara Romero. I came to this country because my husband wanted to kill me. Don't look so shocked. You're the one who's asking me about myself." And immediately I saw this person in my head. Her voice came in so loud. And I said, okay, maybe no one published me again, because I had been trying to get published for. I listened to her on this train ride. I had 45 minutes and wrote everything she said on my phone, writing almost as if I was having conversations with books, but also like my root of my writing comes from my grandmother and my tias who used to tell stories in the kitchen. And I decided, okay, I'm going to have Cara Romero. I'm going to sell Cara Romero every time I'm on a train, a plane, or a bus. Yes, I will move on from writing for the world, but I will write this book for myself. And that's how she came to me.
Fantastic. That's a beautiful segue. I would love to hear the excerpt. Each of our authors has been asked to choose a quick 2-minute excerpt to read from their book so you can hear it in their own voice. Angie, would you read yours?
Sure.
Great.
Yeah. I've never done something like this before. I didn't going to have of my life. La profesora said that you'll help me. You're Dominicana, no? She said, if you know, I could, because I need a job. The factory closed in 2007, right before Christmas. Can you believe that? Almost 2 years I don't work. In reality, El Obama has been very generous. After the factory closed, I received 53 checks. Then El Obama gave me 13 checks, then 20 more. Did he have a choice? No. There are no jobs. My factory left to Costa Rica. You know they're never coming back. Okay.
Thank you.
We'll skip me. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Angie. We are having a couple of technical difficulties, but we'll try to get that sorted out as we go along. Sarah, let's move on to you and Sneha, who I absolutely love and feel so much in common with in many cases. Tell us a little bit about her, how you discovered her.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so good to be here with all of you. Hi to everyone who joined, who's tuning in. Sneha is the protagonist of my novel, All This Could Be Different. At the opening of the book, she is a 22-year-old recent college graduate who has moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city where she knows nobody, and proceeds really over the course of most of the novel to reckon with, in the course of a year, her first job, which is a grueling corporate flunky, her first love, this beautiful enigmatic ballet dancer, and her first real friends. Sneha was sort of intentionally something between, I wouldn't say an anti-hero, but less than flattering everyman. She's very specific. She has her own very specific personal history. She's Indian American, or an Indian immigrant who does not necessarily look like, sort of like cricket and Bollywood, like representation of what it means to be Indian American. She comes from a very specific place and a specific culture in India. And she is quite gay and really throughout the book in deep conflict with what it means for her to be, like queer or sapphic, and to be coming from this very conservative origin point. So in many ways, you're watching this young person who is at once struggling under, all the indignities of racial capitalism, who is sort of slowly coming towards a certain kind of politicization, mostly due to her good friends, and looking in so many ways for a home and her people. So that's Sneha. Would you like me to briefly read?
Please.
Okay. All this could be different. I would like to tell a story of a different time. I was 22, a teak switch of a girl. I had finished college. There were not many jobs. The economy had punctured like a tire. Obama had won a second term. He said, jobs, healthcare, national healing. He said, Trayvon Martin could have been my son. I was moved by this, thought that sort of imaginative exercise bravery. I would listen to his speeches on NPR as I dressed for work. I had found a job. This set me apart from my college friends. I was a consultant, or going to be. This despite my RD degree. A consultant in training, 3 toddlers hiding in a suit. I did not consider myself a sellout. What I felt was that I had been saved from drowning. My classmates without jobs had moved in with their parents, were working unpaid internships with noble nonprofits. I wished them well. My parents were not with me, had left me to make my way in the new country. I was glad they did not, for now, need me to send them money. They had before. My boss had first offered me $19 an hour. His firm was tiny, only 9 people. I said, thank you, I will think on it. I walked to a good restaurant in my college town and drank a full glass of white wine in the middle of the afternoon. I called him back. I said, hello, Peter. I have another offer, but I want to work with you. Would you consider 30? In the space between the gin bottles, the mirrored bar showed me a soft-featured girl, skin the color of Hennessy, eyes vacant with fear. My boss said, like a god granting a boon, 23 an hour. You will relocate to Milwaukee, where your client is. I will pay for your apartment. That sounds great, I said. I may have added, I'm honored to get to work for you. All nonsense. Once I hung up, I punched the air and yelled. I remember the restaurant as deserted, but it may not have been. This is not a story about work or precarity. I'm trying late in the evening to say something about love, which for many of us is not separable from the other shit. As the summer began, I moved to Milwaukee, a rusted city where I had nobody, parents 2 oceans away. I lay on the sun-warmed wood floor of my paid-for apartment and decided I would be a slut. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. I teach creative writing, and I'm always telling my students to look for those moments when a story or a novel just sort of grabs you with both fists. And I just remember feeling it so early with yours, that line about like the toddlers in a suit. There are so many different ways of saying that one is sort of pretending to be an adult. And I thought, like, this is a voice that I want to hang out with for a while. So glad I got a chance to hear you read that. Jonathan, let's move to you and talk a little bit about Trelawney.
Yeah, so If I Survive You follows a family of Jamaicans who moved from Kingston to Miami in the late 1970s. And various members of the family get points of view, but as you alluded to, Trelawney is kind of the main character of the book. And so he's the only American-born member of this family of Jamaicans. And as we meet him, he's trying to figure out where it is that he fits within his own family, where he fits within the city of Miami, and how he fits as an American, or a Jamaican American, or Jamaican, as we say, if any of those categories or identities kind of fit him. As he gets older, he graduates from college in the Midwest, and he comes back to Miami, and he's decided, in a sense, to embrace his Jamaicanness in a way that actually makes his father feel very uncomfortable. And they wind up getting into an argument. His father kicks him out of his house. And pretty much for the rest of the book, Trelawney's trying to figure out how to put a roof back over his head. I came to him as a character, like the writer side of me discovered him when I was applying to MFA programs, maybe 13 years ago now. And I had been writing these characters who were very kind of outside of my personal experience. They were very kind of blank characters who had no kind of racial or ethnic background, or at least I wasn't talking about them. Much of what I had been reading up to that point kind of performed similarly. So I, in a sense, I felt like I was copying what I'd been reading, rather than kind of, taking a look around myself and seeing how people actually live and operate, especially in a multicultural city like Miami, where your cultural identity is I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say it's everything to you in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to write, in a sense, a much truer story than I had been attempting to up to that point. And so that's where I kind of stumbled upon Trelawney and his feelings of frustration within his family, with the family dynamics as this kind of not quite Jamaican son and not quite perfect son of the United States.
Thank you. I believe you're going to read from the first story, Influx.
Oh, yes. I will read from Influx. This is the beginning of the book. This is in Trelawney's perspective. And this is just the opening page or so. It begins with, "What are you?" Hollered from the perimeter of your front yard when you're 9, younger probably. You'll be asked again throughout junior high and high school. Then, out in the world, in strip clubs, in food courts, over the phone, and at various menial jobs. The askers are expectant. They demand immediate gratification. Their question lifts you slightly off your pre-adolescent toes, tilting you, not just because you don't understand it, but because even if you did understand this question, you wouldn't yet have an answer. Perhaps it starts with, "What language is your mother speaking?" This might be the genesis, not because it comes first, but because, at least on this occasion, you have some context for the question when it arrives. You immediately resent this question. "Why's your mother talk so funny?" your neighbor insists. Your mother calls to you from the front porch, has called from this perch overlooking the sloping yard since you were allowed to join the neighborhood kids and play. Always, this signals that playtime is over. Only now, shame has latched itself to the ritual. Perhaps you'd hoped no one would ever notice. Perhaps you'd never noticed it yourself. Perhaps you ask in shallow protest, "What do you mean, what language?" Maybe you only think it. Ultimately, you mutter, "English. She's speaking English," before going inside, head tucked in embarrassment. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, where to begin? I suppose, I've always maintained that immigration, even when it happens under the best of circumstances, it can be a very destabilizing act and sometimes even an outright traumatic one. So let's talk a little bit about the origin stories of your characters and their families in America. How did Sneha and her parents, how did Topper and Sanya, and how did Kata end up immigrating to the United States? And why did you choose to depict these particular circumstances for their arrival in this country? And anyone can jump in.
Oh, for me, so someone starts. Yeah, I was thinking about, I mean, I approached it in so many different ways, but I mean, one way I can't get away from is the fact that my own parents emigrated to the US in the late 1970s. And I am the one, US born member of my immediate family. And for me, I mean, they may have a different perspective on this, but for me, growing up in the United States, growing up in our, whatever it was I made of our kind of class or status, the stories of home that I grew up within my Jamaican household, they were always about Jamaica, and they always sounded in a lot of ways better than what I felt like I was growing up in. My parents were privileged enough to be middle-class Jamaicans. And growing up in the US, as I started to look around and gain awareness, it became kind of apparent that we had lost that solid middle-class status. And my family was kind of on that climb to get back to the middle class. And at the same time, there was also this, I think, self-esteem that my parents had growing up, looking around and seeing people who looked like them, people in prominent positions who looked like them, being, for the most part, a majority Black country, where a racialized experience was not what my parents had to deal with on a day-to-day. There's a way in which, as the next generation, you might, it's not that you want to oversimplify it or ever idealize it, but there are ways in which I felt kind of envious of that experience. And I wanted to talk about that because often my experience talking to Americans about Jamaica is that there's this kind of assumption like, oh, you must be so grateful that your parents moved you to here, because all Jamaicans live in poverty and the circumstances are so bad in Jamaica that you must, it's this kind of one-sided flattening of, emigrating from the third world and now you're in America, congratulations kind of thing. And I wanted to take a more nuanced look at what that might be like or what that is like from my perspective to kind of grow up that next generation with an eye looking forward, but also an eye looking backwards.
Thanks, Jonathan. I relate to a lot of that. My parents were always talking about Korea as sort of the sunnier times of their lives. And then, that just confused me, particularly as a child, thinking like, well, why did we come here? Why did we settle in North Dakota of all places? Yeah. Sarah, Angie? Sarah, I think you are on mute.
It's not like we've been doing this for years.
Right.
My protagonist, Sneha, comes to the US in her mid-teens. I came in my late teens. And her story is one where basically she experiences within her family a certain microwaved version for a period of years of the American dream. So her story is that she comes with her family. There is absolutely hardship and privation. There always is. I completely agree with you, Jung, that immigration is a trauma in the best of times. It's a huge rupture in the life of a person or a family, unless you come from very significant wealth and privilege and you're just sort of moving from cosmopolitan place A to cosmopolitan place B. But anyway, within Sneha's life, for the period of her until her late teens, things are looking up for a while. Her dad starts a business. There are all these ways in which they ascend to middle class, and with the possibility of even years or decades down the line becoming upper middle class. And then her dad becomes criminalized. He gets caught up in a case, the book is light on the details, partly because you have adult Sneha talking about this in summary to her friend, and the way that she is as a character, she doesn't like reflecting on the difficult parts of her past, so she tends to skate over them. But in short, the family was criminalized, or specifically Sneha's dad was. And so at the beginning of the book, she's sort of, she makes references to her parents 2 oceans away. It's because they had to leave, it's because her dad chose to self-deport in lieu of being forcefully deported after he had, served his time. And that's not, that part is not drawn from life, or my own life. It is the experience of people that I know. I have had my own, like my family has had a brush with the deportation machine of this country, but it was in my case specifically. But overall, I think that I wanted to figure out how to tell an immigration story that, while it minds certain things that I knew from experience, didn't end up accidentally reifying a certain kind of American exceptionalism. And that informed a lot of choices that I made with Sneha's life.
Thank you, Sarah. There's that part where Sneha talks about how her parents they won the lottery, like winning the lottery, winning this opportunity to come to America. And it's really sad what happens to her parents, how they have to go back, and she's in this country all by herself and really feeling that sense of loneliness. Thank you. Absolutely. Angie, we already heard that first sort of riveting line from your book, I think, where, well, no, you didn't actually read that part. Tell us about how Cata Romero came to this country. And it is the first line of the book. And
I'm sorry, my tech was bad. So I guess you didn't hear me telling the story of how I came to that story. But basically, when she came to me, that was the first line that came to me that I started writing, is actually the first line of the book, which is, my name is Cata Romero. I came to this country because my husband wanted to kill me. And I started there, and I just stayed with her for a year, just listening to all the things she wanted to tell me. And, it's interesting because, usually, like, my first novel was about being American, right? Like being a New Yorker, being born in New York, and a lot like Jonathan, who was like, basically, what I love that you do in your book, which is it's similar to some of the things I'm grappling with, is how sometimes there's this assumption that becoming more integrated or Americanized is actually has a value. But if our value is that we actually want to go home and feel like we're part of a community, knowing that growing up here, I never felt that I was part of this country or accepted or invited, then you lose that, right? Like, my Spanish is not Dominican enough, my English is not American enough, my intonations. So what's interesting about working on this book with Cata Romero is that I'm listening to her. And when I wrote it, I was like trying to write it as if she was a Spanish speaker, but she was coming to me as an ESL speaker. And I think we're all preoccupied about language because we're constantly code switching. And I think part of home, or what home feels like, is language, right? It's like when you hear that familiar sound in language, or how people say things or expressions. And writing this book was incredibly challenging because I'm not an ESL speaker. My first language is in English. So I had to actually write in a language that I didn't really know well, and come up with rules around it. And it's been fascinating, because thinking about finding home and the theme of this panel, I feel like where I found it was in translation, and working with the translator who translated my books in Spanish. Because in the work of the translation, my characters get closer to some degree to the place that I'm trying to reach, that I can't reach, that I haven't been able to find. So this game of language, to me, that I keep exploring in all my books in a very different way, are all about finding home. Like, where am I most at home when I'm constantly code switching?
Thank you so much, Angie. I'm actually going to read a quote from your book. This is narrated by Cata, who says, "It is not easy to say I am American, because when someone says American, they don't imagine me," which I just think is such a beautiful line. And it gets at some of the difficulty of claiming America as one's home, even if they have lived there for a very long time, which is, Cata's case, she's been here for over 2 decades. And also Trelawney's case, even though he was born in the US and is a second-generation immigrant. What kind of tensions related to identity and acceptance were you really grappling with and committed to including in your books, and what particular challenges were there in doing that work well on the page? Jump in, someone.
Okay.
Angie, your connection is much better, by the way. So we're all
I'm
set.
using my phone now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
What
My internet timed out briefly.
Oh yeah, I think mine did too.
So I'm so sorry. It was a disaster. There was like a siren that came by. My internet timed out. So could you repeat the question just one more time? Sorry.
Sure. Let's just talk a little bit about the tensions related to identity and acceptance that you were really committed to sort of threading through your book, and if there were any particular challenges in doing that work well.
I can try. I think that one of the things that I was trying to grapple with was, given that this was a novel that was attempting to chart what it means to be in community, what did it look like for this young person, Sneha, who is from a different place, right? Who is in a variety of ways not American, who is in some ways, we're observing her in the process of becoming American, which is, in so many ways, an accumulation of time and choice of affiliation. And I found myself wondering, well, why doesn't she go to the place where her parents are, go to her home of origin? Like, what is her reasoning? And for her, the specific character, it's a reasoning based in meaningful part on this very traumatic, very violent thing that was done to her within her community, within her extended family, that she has come to associate with her place of origin. And the reason I bring that up is I think that it helps me identify, because so much of writing is my attempt to think through something. It helped me identify sort of a central tension that I was trying to explore, which is that community is not actually this like unalloyed good. Community is nothing more or less than other people. And sometimes the communities we find ourselves in are not wonderful for us. I think sometimes communities are just nothing more, nothing less than, the question of who they center and who they exclude. Like, that is the definition of what it means to be a community. It needs to have some boundary around it. And so thinking through that, I think being able to articulate that made me think, okay, this particular immigration story, this particular coming of age story is going to be the charting of someone who starts out atomized and alone and really the victim of a lot of indignity in her work, in her immigration journey, etc., and ends up with this sort of like, bastion of like found family, multiracial found family.
Thank you. Jonathan, Angie?
I love the way you framed that with the boundaries of who is accepted and who is excluded. And I think that's largely what Trelawney is kind of dealing with. He's yearning to be accepted, embraced. There's a point in the first story where it's the Puerto Rican kids who embrace him because they feel he looks more like them at this school. And he hasn't quite realized that they have kind of misidentified him, but he does know that he's finally embraced, and he's willing to go with that for as long as he can until they realize, in fact, that he's of Jamaican background, and he, by the determination of everyone at the school, he should be with the Jamaican kids, but the Jamaican kids aren't embracing him for a number of reasons. I wanted to explore those kind of realities of what happens at that age. This is like happening around middle school and high school as people start to self-segregate. The challenge, I think from the writer's perspective, is thinking about that dynamic, thinking about other dynamics within the African diaspora. I'll say for us in the Black community, we have these diaspora wars where it's like African American and Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, and African from the continent having these kind of perceived tensions, however, real or imagined or exacerbated online. I wanted to, talk about what I believe to be both happening without actually, again, like exacerbating anything. And for me, that's where bringing in real life experience became important, because I didn't want to, it's like if you go into a fiction workshop, oftentimes you're told, conflict is the heart of it, or maybe character is the heart, but the conflict should come from the character. And so you're doing this math that tells you, okay, explode the conflict. And that was a place where I thought it would be unethical to try to explode the conflict just to exploit it for material gain. But trying to actually accurately talk about, again, like a multicultural city like Miami, where there are these kind of smaller tensions where people will still get along, they'll still marry into a different culture, and then still hold prejudices against that culture, and they'll be aired at the dinner table. And people will just agree to disagree and still get along and still create families and children and multiple generations of this. But trying to find that fine line was even talking about it now, I feel very uncomfortable. And that's why I'm a writer, because as a writer, it's like, okay, I can dot my I's and cross my T's and make sure I'm communicating this effectively in a way that isn't just adding to the problem.
I loved what you said about MFA programs, like the things that we were taught and told, and how, I don't know, upon rethinking some things, maybe there's a better way sometimes. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks. Angie, how about you?
I love that you're saying that you feel uncomfortable. I mean, I feel like it is uncomfortable. This is why I'm a writer too. And I feel like we chose to write it through, right? Think it through our writing. And, I have a 15-year-old kid, and he said to me, Mom, like, is it weird that I feel like I belong nowhere? And I said, what do you mean? He goes, I don't know. Like, I'm Dominican, but I'm not Dominican. I'm Italian, but I'm not Italian. I'm not even New York. Like, he feels like every space feels a little bit like his, but none of them quite feel like all his, right? Or like that people actually get him. And I say, oh, you're having the immigrant experience, right? We're in constant motion. And I want to say not just physical motion, but I feel like what I've realized through writing is that we also concurrently live in many different time periods. And what I mean by that is that something that happened that is like a nostalgia of my mother is still as present as something that's happening right now in my life. And in some ways, you think time is not linear when you're thinking about all these different spaces that still are very much alive in every day, right? So in a moment like now, where there's so much, like people are like, I feel like, I don't know, you're in the US and people wake up and they're like, oh my God, something's happening abroad. And I'm like, oh my God, what's happening now? Like every day something's happening abroad. And as an immigrant, I feel like I feel, at least in my life, I'm constantly thinking about, as I'm here, there's so much going on that is connected to my reality that is scary and terrifying all the time, right? Like, it's just, we can't stop thinking about it because we're still tethered in a way to all these places. And they're also as real as being here, right? That has to do with our histories. So in my book, Cara Romero, right? Like, she left because of her husband was trying to kill her. I mean, Dominican Republic right now, it's very high up on the list of femicides. It's a very, something that is, domestic violence, young girls being married off because there's no way to survive outside of partnership. It's very, very scary what's happening. So when we talk about migration, or like, why don't you go home? For me, it's a privilege, right? I could travel, I could maybe decide to go back, but most people can't. And I feel like writing through it and feeling uncomfortable around that privilege, but also that estrangement, because we do have access and we do have resources and we do have, and living with all of that concurrently, it's hard to talk about. That's why we have to write the books. It's a lot. It's so much,
It really is. Thank you, Angie. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I can't believe how much time is like zooming past me right now. One of the things that I just remember very vividly from my childhood is that my parents were always working. And it was very, very normal in our household to not see one or both of them for most of the waking hours of the day between my school hours and their work hours. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized that because they had moved so far away from their families and were so cut off from them, because we lived in North Dakota where there wasn't an Asian American community, much less a Korean American community, they just had like absolutely no safety net whatsoever. So work is a subject that crosses over all three of your books. So I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about the jobs that your characters have, what they do for work, and why you chose to give them those particular jobs.
I can go first and quick. My character Sneha is a junior change management consultant, which, you know, during a lot of the book you see that she's like kind of a glorified intern. I use the phrase corporate flunky, and things go badly with her work, especially later in the novel. And there's a period of time where she is functionally unemployed because her boss is committing wage theft against her. And she starts to work at Leon's, a Milwaukee institution, and which it's like, it serves custard. So she's like a custard scooper. So those are the two main jobs, I would say.
I love how consultant, like management consultant, sounds like such a appealing job to some people, but it's really like the most soul-sucking spreadsheet producing kind of work that one could possibly do.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's
really devoid of glamour.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love the question. Also, I was very much a latchkey kid. Come home, open the can of Chef Boyardee, and see my parents sometime, I guess. Yeah, my characters have so many jobs, and in the book, and Trelawney in particular takes on a lot of strange jobs. There's at the beginning of a story in the book called Odd Jobs, he actually starts listing all of the weird jobs he's taken on, like working at an exotic animals dealer and trying to wrangle a caiman for the owner of the place, or serving poolside in a Speedo, or he starts taking on these weird jobs from Craigslist. And for me, I get distracted if I'm reading a book that doesn't pay attention to where the money's coming from. Like, how is a person actually surviving and paying their rent as, whatever else is happening in the story is happening. So I wanted to pay a lot of attention to that. But I also found when I was very broke and trying to figure out, if I could actually survive and be a writer also, I would troll Craigslist. Maybe troll isn't the right word, but I would be on it looking for these jobs that I could pick up. And it was the ones that I didn't feel any kind of safety or I think my good sense saved me from actually showing up for these more out there jobs. But my memory, I kind of latched onto some of these. So for instance, one job, the latter job that he picks up in the book, he sees a post from a well-to-do white couple who's asking for a tall, heavy black man to show up and watch them in bed. And that's a post I've seen like several times on the internet, many times over, really. And I wanted to, explore, again, identity and race and blackness through that lens of, well, what is it actually like? What's the essence of what they want from the Black body? What value is the Black body adding to that bedroom and their sexual life? But then I had to imagine my way into that story, and that's where I started to thinking about the more tried and true version of, well, where could this go in terms of conflict, and what happens after he watches them in bed? What's going to be the next thing that happens when he shows up to this condo in this kind of wealthier part of Miami? So I think seeing, what people are actually, because I feel like the seedier parts of the internet are really great places to, find a source of inspiration for fiction. But then unless you are actually going to put yourself in that position, the imagination kind of takes over from there.
Yeah, you know, I think I'm probably old enough to be Trelawney's mom, and there are several points in the book where I'm like, oh God, please don't take that job. Please don't take that job. And of course he takes those jobs. And it does create like really rich situations for storytelling. So, oh, Trelawney. Angie, Kata is actually looking for work, and that is the premise of your book. But she does a lot of other work that I would love to hear about.
Yeah, so in this book, it's basically organized in 12 sessions, right? And in each session, she's going to this program during the Great Recession that is called the Senior Workforce Program. And I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So it's like a loud horn, you know, it's like, they don't want me to speak. New York doesn't want me to speak. Okay. So it's like, so in these 12 sessions, she's speaking to a job counselor who's trying to help her find work. And I was going to look for it. I was like, I'm going to try to find this line because I don't, it was just so funny when I wrote it, I laughed out loud, but basically she's being asked in a job application, when can you work? And she says, well, I can work all the time. I need a job. I can work at all hours, except I can't work between, 6 and 9 because I'm picking up the kids. And I can't work between like 3 and 4 because that's when I make lunch for the elder. And then I can't work from this time to this time. But yes, I'm available at all hours. And I feel like what I realized in writing the book, and I think it leads to one of the questions of one of the audience members, is like in writing the book, what I discovered is that even if she really wanted to work after working 26 years at this factory, like maybe she should be subsidized to do all the invisible labor that she's been doing for the community all these years, right? Like her not working actually just gave her a lot more time to do all the things our system is not doing for taking care of children, the elderly, the neighborhood. So I guess I didn't realize it when I started it, but when I ended the book, I was like, oh yeah, this is in some ways trying to make visible what so many people I know are doing and elders are doing in the community when they're being called unemployed,
Yeah. The structure is absolutely brilliant, Angie. And I do love, like, by the time we get to the end of the book, how we see how hard this woman is working when she's supposedly not working in the ways that would count for, Social Security or a labor stat or something like that. And she is hard working all the time.
And the thing is that it's an important thing to keep bringing up in a moment where, especially the migrant, oh my God, I'm surrounded by, in New York City, people who have just been, brought into New York City without support systems. And, and I think like the rhetoric about immigrants is this laziness, certain kinds of immigrants. And in reality, I'm like, I don't know anyone who's not working all the time. It's impossible to live in New York and not work all the time. So in some ways, I think it's like really important that we keep thinking or at least like rename.
Congresswoman.
Sorry, keep going.
No, it's just renaming what that looks like, right? Like, or rethinking about that because it's problematic. Anyway, go ahead, Sarah, sorry. I heard somebody.
Oh, I think that was Sarah, but I think she just muted herself, so we're good. So I know that we've been talking a lot about tensions and difficulties, and I don't want to give the audience the wrong impression, because within each of these books, there is love and friendship and joy and humor, whether that comes from the communities that these characters are a part of or somewhere deep within their own reserves. So could we spend a little bit of time talking about that aspect of your books? Where does all of this come from?
I think that in my writing, I often look for this question of like, where can the reader find pleasure, right? Like, what is actually joyful or joyous to read? Where can you find beauty? Where can you find meaning? Because I think that especially, working as artists in 2023 or in the 2020s, like we're given so many so many reasons to despair, frankly, right? And so I was trying to when I was trying to locate where pleasure could be found in the pages that I was writing even before I knew what this book was or was going to be, I kept thinking about just like what was pleasurable for me to read. And I was like, I kind of want to read a love story, so I'm going to try to write a love story. And then as I started like working my way through the love story that is one of the strands of All This Could Be Different, between Sneha and her eventual girlfriend, Marina. And they have kind of a, like will they, won't they thing that, I've heard a reader call like a little bit like Sally Rooney-esque, and that they're young people who are like missing the mark with each other continually. But I also found myself wondering about the ways in which it can be possible to like overly like, reify or to treat as sacrosanct societally the unit of the romantic couple and the romantic partnership. And the more I paid attention to my, like dumbass 22-year-old character, the more I felt confident that she would not be finding the love and partnership of her life at this point in time. And so All This Could Be Different sort of became this story of friendship and deep and abiding friendship, and the way it can carry you through life and through really hard and dark moments. I felt interested, I think, in exploring this question of like, what is it we owe our friends? There's a point in the novel where Sneha sort of midway through is just sort of matter-of-factly like, when her best friend Tig starts to date somebody seriously, somebody who becomes her eventual partner. And she's like, it's the way of the world. Your close friends, like are like an audition for, what eventually happens, which is you find, you've like, they're the sort of holding place for your eventual like husband or wife or what have you. And this book was in some ways an attempt to undermine that a little bit, to show that friendship is valuable on its own terms.
I love Tig. I feel like we should all have a friend like Tig, or aspire to be like Tig as a friend to others. Great. Jonathan, Angie?
Yeah, that was, I reading Sarah's book, I enjoyed just kind of hanging out with those characters. I've told Sarah that before, but it was like, oh.
So I feel about both your books. That's so lovely to hear.
Yeah, I don't know. My main character tends to be searching for the connection. He wants a kind of love that he's never really felt from his own father. His romantic relationships are kind of failing him. And I think in a way, part of that is, part of our economic system, that he's, at one point he reflects on the fact that he starts seeing someone, but she kind of realizes that he's living out of his vehicle, and that's no place to maybe start the relationship from, or so he's told. But the If I Survive You, apart from the second person where these characters are sometimes talking to themselves and telling themselves the story of what's happened, there's a lot of direct address in the book, and I felt like Trelawney was reaching out to the reader in a sense, and trying to get that sense of connection, and saying, at times he asks, what would you do in this particular circumstance, especially as it pertains to his trying to navigate moral ambiguities. The humor, I think, is, I don't know, it's just like the easier and the harder part for me to answer, because I think it's difficult to talk about like what makes a book funny or humorous. And at the same time, I think it's a very natural tool for people who feel disempowered to use humor as a coping mechanism and use it against these bigger structures that, they otherwise can't topple as an individual human being. And for me, that was kind of a big part of it. And also creating, I think to be really funny, you have to be really smart. And I think creating a character who even though he is often, failing to do certain things, he's also really good at pointing out some of the absurdities about life, and pointing out why, the system, certain systems are either failing or working in the way that they were meant to oppress us. And in that, I feel like there's a kind of comfort in traveling on this journey with him, because you know he has this kind of sharp tool in order to really unpack the way the world might work.
You know, I was thinking about like this question of pleasure. I was just like, when you said pleasure, I was like, oh yes, let's talk about pleasure. How beautiful. But I also was thinking, like, for a lot of us, like we were writing also in this time or editing during pandemic, right? And I feel like all of us, I feel like, you know, definitely in both your works, like Jonathan, like the way you use language, like it was so inspiring. Like when I was reading it, I was just like, oh my God, language, how beautiful. Like it's like eating something rich, you know? And I think that, and, you know, and I listened to your book, Sarah, and I remember like re-listening to it because it was so sensual, like tactile. I literally felt like I was touching people. And I feel like, one of the things that I have found that have happened with us, like at least me reading on my phone, like I read a lot of essays, I'm scanning, I'm trying to get the information. And like, we're artists, right? Like we have to remember we're artists, right? So what do we do? Like as artists is try to do it differently, right? Like perfect title, all this could be different. Like the ways we tell the story should be different. The way we use language is different. The things we should be pointing at toward should be different. So thinking about rethinking friendships, like why have we let TV hijack what friendships look like, or coming home looks like, or what language looks like, or the hierarchy. And in some ways, like what I appreciate about what's happening now in literature is that we're literally just like rejecting all of that, right? And just saying, you know what, ESL is English, like that's cool, right? Like, you know, like, I think it wasn't Jonathan, I don't know if you said in an interview, or I don't know, I think you said this about Miami and Jamaica and language, about like how, you know, the more Jamaican you sound, the more like valuable you're seen and part of the community versus,
yeah.
What was it that you said?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, there's like an assumption that this movement towards what we might believe to be is a standard American English, or I don't think we would put the word, you know, dialect on it. But, you know, within Jamaican communities in the United States, the more you hold on to the Jamaican patois, the accent, the language, like that's where you're higher up in the hierarchy within our community, is what I mean to say. And so, you know, I think that's not just happening with Jamaicans in Miami. I think that's happening with a lot of communities in Miami, because, you know, Miami, last statistic I saw was that Miami was the city that had the most people who were born outside of the United States. Those populations coming together, we're not necessarily subject to the same kind of pressures to assimilate, because in a place like Miami, like what are you assimilating into when the dominant culture, we're certainly influenced by, you know, the rest of America and TV and media and all of those things. I don't mean to suggest we're not, but when you go outside and you actually see your neighbors, most of us are hanging on to some elements of our cultures, and language is a massive part of that, obviously, in all the ways that it, you know, operates in complex ways.
It is 8 o'clock already. So I'm going to turn it over to the Q&A board. There is still time for members of the audience to get their questions in, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Let's see. The first one is, I'm wondering if the authors could describe their writing communities. Who do they turn to for moral support, craft advice, etc.? Great question.
I'm someone who's been in some form of, I'm institutionalized. I have the MFA, and then I got into a PhD, but then Stanford's Stegner fellowship took me away. So I've had the kind of privilege of being around a lot of, you know, mostly really intelligent people who have craft on the mind and fiction on the mind, and who are in a position where, you know, they want to exchange work, and they want to sit around and talk about writing. Now that I've finished with the Stegner, we'll see what that kind of looks like. But those have been it's evolved over the years. My thing, I have some of my favorite readers, some of whom I met in college, but I think it can be helpful to, in a sense, vary your go-to readers, just because after a certain point, you understand what I'm trying to do almost too well. You trust me too much. So after a while, I'm handing you that 300 pages and you're saying, you know what, this is what Jonathan goes after. He does that kind of thing. You're good to go. And, you know, I still think you need to be challenged a little bit. I think it's helpful if people understand your intentions, but a little bit of pushback, if you're really trying to push yourself, push the envelope, can be helpful.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, you know, I feel like I love talking about this particular book, like my community. I wrote a lot of it pretty isolated. So what happens is, after you write a number of books, you don't want anyone to read your work because you don't want to burden them. You just don't want to burden people with your writing, like your bad writing. And maybe you're just too embarrassed because you're supposed to have figured it out. But the truth is, every book, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just like totally as lost. It's like you have this amnesia of how a novel works. So, but in this particular book, when I was working on it, because it's all monologues, I would read it out loud all the time. And I learned something about community and writing, because, you know, I do have a few friends that if I'm really desperate, I'll reach out to them. But because I was reading it out loud at home a lot, I would find like whoever was in my house became my most, you know, my best person to hear my story. And they necessarily weren't writers. So I had a friend who was staying with me for 2 days, and she was listening to me and she goes, "Oh my God, I'm an actress. I could read this as a monologue." And she started reading it. And when she started reading it, and she was an ESL speaker, it was like a gift. I realized like there were so many opportunities I was missing because she was fumbling. So then I was correcting, right? Like a playwright. But then another instance, my kid he would just hang out on the sofa while I was reading the book out loud. And he said, "Mom, I think you can what if she doesn't throw the iron at him?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? You're listening to what I'm reading out loud?" I thought he was scrolling his phone. He's like, "Of course I'm listening. You're telling a story." And he actually helped me fix a plot point. He's like, "If you change something here, it will open it up so something else can happen later." You know, he watches a lot of Star Wars and Marvel Universe. So he's really interested in like plots that stay open for other plots. And I said, wait, I never even thought to ask him. Right? Because he's a kid. I'm like, what are you going to know about this 56-year-old woman who's like estranged from her son? So my advice is always like Jonathan is saying, like, yes, you could be part of the institution, but sometimes writers are not even your best readers when you're in process. Like sometimes you need a fresh ear.
I think that's very fair.
Writers and readers sometimes pay attention to vastly different things, and you need that reader perspective. I love that.
Yeah, no, my response is similar to Angie's, where I think the overarching truth of my response is I'm figuring it out, you know, because I think that one of the things I'm learning as I write what I hope will become book number 2 is that you can figure it out for your first book, and then you're back to the mat again, back to square one with your second. I think that with All This Could Be Different, I reached out to writer friends, which I was lucky to have for a variety of reasons. I live in New York now. I did, graduate school in creative writing, but the first 5 readers of All This Could Be Different, only one of them was a writer. I wanted this book to be read by my friends in Milwaukee, my working class friends, my friends who were readers, partly because it felt so important to me that I write something that, felt accessible in some way. But yeah, I think that I'm really with both of you in that I try for a mix of writers who I think are really canny and wise about craft, and people who read, who love words, who are living regular lives and have regular person pressures, and to see if to see if our pages can hold their attention, I think it's a really useful test. The last thing I'll say very quickly, based on the spirit of the question, it wasn't just about like, who is your reader, right? It was about like, who is your community who kind of keeps you, like humble and cared for and all the rest of it. And I think that for me and for many people is the work of a lifetime, it's sort of slow, ongoing work. All This Could Be Different really happened in so many ways because I was doing a lot of organizing work in my community at the time. And I reached out to other people who were doing it with me. And I was like, hey, I want to take a little bit of a step back and like work on this book, which meant that literally like my comrades, my fellow organizers had to do way more, like for a period of like 2 months, like their workloads increased by like a measurable amount of hours. Like they each had to do like 6 more hours of work a week or something. And I've never forgotten that, I thank them in my acknowledgements. It isn't lost on me that in my novel where I was writing about interdependence, and care, the novel itself was made possible by other people's care.
And I want to add, because I know we have to wrap up, but Sarah, like asking for support is the way to get support. It never occurred to me as an immigrant daughter. We're not supposed to say we need anything, but actually like asking for support, like you said, I'm going to take a step back, even if that means that some people have to step up, like it's just the only way it's going to happen, right? Like if you're really going to believe in interdependence, then you actually have to also be okay with asking for support.
I love that so much.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, Angie. Thank you. Let's see what the question board has. There is a question for Jonathan that I want to make sure we ask because I do wonder about it myself. How did you work to create short stories that could stand alone, but also as a novel? What are the challenges and benefits of a story cycle like this?
Oh, so hard. It was the hardest thing about writing the book. I kicked myself and cursed myself at a certain point once I realized that's what I had done. I went into the book wanting to do that. I thought I was just going to call it a novel, but I wanted it to be the perfect novel, which meant I wanted it to be. I love what Angie was saying earlier about, we're artists and we want to challenge ourselves and we want to do things differently, and we want people to see the world anew through our creations. The great challenge there is that if you call it a novel, we can rightfully assume what kind of order you're going to read it in. But that then creates certain expectations around the connectivity and how much space you're leaving between your what you would call chapters. When I realized that wasn't exactly the kind of book I was writing, and I would need to be calling it something closer to like a linked story collection, I had the challenge of not having each story be redundant. I wondered, how much if they're going to stand alone, well, do I have to reestablish, where this family's from, who these characters are in every single story? Or am I just kind of diving in with an assumption that, readers have met these characters before in some way? And that was tough. If you're a writer yourself and you're trying to do it, I would say add more information and then, come back to it and kind of carve away, because for me it stopped my writing for a while, because I wasn't smart enough to figure it out for a while until I was, but I realized afterwards, the help of agents and editors and other wise people can help you in determining what's extra, what's redundant, and then creating threads. What brings it all together is the threads that it's like a detail in the first story that I bring back somewhere in the middle of the book that I then conclude in the final story. That was the funnest part, actually, and just kind of going through, reading the whole manuscript, making a list of all the details and seeing how many of those I could thread throughout the entire book, one by one, because there's a real pleasure. Like we talked about pleasure, there's a real pleasure for the reader when they come to that really great use of repetition, where it's like, oh, that I thought that one detail was insignificant, and now it's come back and now it's actually powerful, and then you kind of explode that on the page in the good way as a writer, and it's satisfying for a writer to do as well. So drawing those threads throughout without worrying too much about the redundancy, and then eventually cutting out the redundancy was the thing. It's about as articulate as I can be about it right now.
Jonathan, did Under the Aki Tree, did that first appear in the Paris Review?
That was in the Paris Review. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading that when it first came out and just falling in love with that voice and thinking, oh, this author must be like writing an entire novel sort of built around Popper's voice. And then to see it as a short story in a link connection and how like each story sort of builds into the other and layers upon each other. It's just so beautifully and intricately done. It just makes me jealous and kind of want to write short stories, which I will never do. But I just love the structure of that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You know, I'm looking at the time and we have basically come to the end. Please don't go anywhere yet because I'm going to ask Caroline Schreiber, Penn Faulkner's Director of Development, to join us for a second. But before we hear from Caroline, I just want to thank our authors for being part of this program and to thank all of you for being with us tonight. These are really hard and challenging and confusing times. So please do take good care of yourselves, take good care of each other. And with that, I will just say thank you and over to Caroline.
Thanks, Jung. And thank you to all of our panel for this really excellent discussion. It's been fun to watch. My name is Caroline Schreiber, and I'm Penn Faulkner's Director of Development. As you probably already know from joining this conversation, Penn Faulkner reaches thousands of readers and writers and students every year through literary programs like this one, education programs in partnership with DC Title I schools, and our annual awards. We are a nonprofit organization, so we rely on donations from readers and writers like you all to accomplish our mission. I'm here tonight in particular because we have an exciting opportunity. We've just announced a $100,000 matching challenge in support of the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story, which means that when you give, your donation will have double the impact. Every dollar counts, and we're already about a quarter of the way towards meeting our goal for this year. So my ask for you tonight is this: will you give $5 to support great literature? You can donate before you log off tonight by using the link in the chat. And speaking of supporting great literature, we hope you'll join us in person for this year's Penn Malamud Awards ceremony. That'll be held at American University in DC on December 1st. Thank you all so much again for joining us tonight, and thank you in advance for supporting Penn Faulkner. We hope to see you all again soon. Good night.